Welcome, everyone. I'm Danielle Ofri, Editor-in-Chief of Bellevue Literary Review, and welcome to The Book Doctors Are In. And this is part of BLR's first writing workshop, the Literary RX, and we'll have some conversations about creative writing in healthcare. We'll talk about navigating ethical dilemmas using writing. A big thank you to the Josiah Macy Foundation for helping to fund this whole project, and a huge thank you to the Bellevue Literary Review staff. I'm really pleased to welcome Perri Klass, Damon Tweedy, and Esther Choo, three of my favorite medical writers. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about our writing, how we got here, what we've done.
So happy to be here, and thank you all for coming virtually. I'm a pediatrician by training, a general pediatrician. I'm coming to you from New York City, where I work at New York University, where I am, I think I can safely say, the world's only professor of journalism and pediatrics, which is a job that was shaped to me. I'm a pediatrician, and I write about pediatrics, and I also teach in a journalism department, and I run a medical humanities minor here at NYU. And I write journalism, I write personal essays, I write reported journalism in which I often report on medical topics. I write fiction, short stories and novels. I've even written for television.
I'm Esther Choo. I'm an emergency medicine physician at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon, here on the West Coast. And I actually am mostly a health services researcher, and 90% of the writing I do is scientific writing for medical journals, and things that we kind of will jokingly say, like, only my mother will read, and a few other people who are like really, really in the weeds of some of the topics that I'm interested in. But fortunately, I also have a little 10% of my writing that is op-eds for the general public. I'm a columnist for MSNBC. And then I will also do some op-eds for medical journals, where I can be a little bit just more fluid about expressing opinion. And most of that is done for BMJ or for The Lancet.
I am, Damon Tweedy. I'm a psychiatrist coming from Duke, and I divide my time between the VA hospital and Duke. And so I both do clinical medicine, but also a lot of academic sort of teaching medical students. And yes, I'm here from Raleigh-Durham area. And so the type of writing that I do is basically, I guess it would be called narrative nonfiction. Is probably how it would be sort of classified. A lot of sort of storytelling about doctor-patient encounters and kind of what they mean in a larger sphere of issues, whether it's race or whether it's mental health issues.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'll say, so I'm Danielle Ofri. I'm a primary care doctor at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. If you don't know Bellevue, it's the oldest public hospital in the country. And I do general writing, I guess narrative nonfiction. I've done memoir. I've written about topics, medical error, and book-length topics, medical error, communication, and then do commentary work for the New York Times, op-eds, a couple of pieces for the New Yorker. And then I read a lot of manuscripts for Bellevue Literary Review, and we can talk a bit about getting published later. But this year we got 5,000 manuscripts submitted to Bellevue Literary Review, so there's a ton of interest. And Lila Damon has been BLR's nonfiction editor for a couple of years, and now he's moved on to his own writing because there's another book coming out. But it's been great to work with him. And I would say probably the two most common questions I get from people who email is how did you get started, and how do you do it in your current life? And then maybe how do you get into the New York Times, and can you share your editor's email? Which the answer is always no, because that's a real no-no to share editors' emails randomly. But I think the idea of how we came to writing in our clinical career. So Esther, I'll start with you, just go in a different order.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just one of those kids that always grew up knowing that I wanted to write. And I think part of it is that I grew up in a non-English speaking household. And so my earliest memories are having a really hard time communicating, especially spontaneously. And it made me a really shy kid. But when I wrote and I had time, I could communicate really well. And so I think that was the way that I felt empowered as like a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, is I could communicate really well on paper. So I think I can't remember a time when I didn't think I was going to grow up and be a writer. So I was an English major, and I did a journalism internship at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, just a mid-sized paper in Cleveland. And I came out of that feeling like I'm not going to be a journalist, for a lot of reasons. And I also felt like I really wanted to be like, you cover a lot of tragedy when you're a journalist. They put us on every beat. We cycled through every beat and we saw a lot of tough things. And I felt like it is hard for me to not want to just forget the writing piece and step in and help. And that started a process that led me to medicine. But I never really lost the writing itch. And I think when I became health services researcher and I was writing so much, it wasn't the right kind of writing because I also wanted to be creative and I wanted to have feelings. And scientific writing is really without a lot of feelings or actually even strong opinions. Everything is very circumspect and sort of you write in a certain way that is free from bias. And I have lots of feelings. So I think it wasn't until I was uh, a attending physician that I bumped up against something that I felt like I really wanted to talk about. And I can't even remember what it was. It was something I encountered in the emergency department that I felt that, people needed to know this was happening. And so with one of my colleagues, we wrote this very small op-ed for a Rhode Island newspaper. And when they accepted it, we were like so thrilled. It was like we won the Nobel Prize. And like, we felt world famous, when your like first thing gets published, you feel world famous. I'm sure like 14 people read it, but it was so empowering to feel like I could write something that had a point of view that was not a scientific piece. And then after that, it was just a process of pitching, sort of, gradually increasing spheres and pitching and writing and getting rejected. And, even today, it's like a nice mix of having relationships with editors who will reach out and be like the BMJ, they're so lovely. They're like, hello, it seems like interesting things are happening in the United States. Would you like to educate our global audience about it? And it's like, it's so nice to be able to get that ask. And there's plenty of times when I also pitch to a variety of people. But usually it's like, I'm walking out of the ER feeling really upset about some gaps for our patients or about things that are happening that really the public should know. So maybe we can agitate for policies and practices that are better so that people can live better and whole lives. So that's kind of...
It's fascinating. You talked about growing up in a non-English speaking home and the challenges of communication. That really makes me think about our patients who have so many communication challenges, even when they do speak English. I just spent the morning in clinic and, I had a patient who was speaking in Spanish, but had such a complex problem. And even with an interpreter and my halfway Spanish, it was still so hard to communicate that. And I can see the frustration that it couldn't get me to see what was really bothering her. And it just makes us, I think, be very sensitive to that. And I'm also intrigued by how you were in writing first and came to medicine second. And Damon, I think you were the other way around, right?
Yeah, so Esther and I, we were on a panel together back in 2019. I didn't know those details. That's really cool to hear some of that story. So I came from a very different background in the sense that I never thought I would be a writer. I can kind of honestly say that I was probably high school before I took a book and read it from, cover to cover, I mean, well through high school, and never imagined, thinking about being a writer. And so for me, it was very much, went to med school, biology major in college, focused on initially wanted to become either interventional cardiologist or an orthopedic surgeon. I was very sort of focused in that kind of way. And then one day in medical school, I came across one of these, I think it was probably, it's either with Annals of Internal Medicine or JAMA. And, those historically have had these sort of essays where, physician narratives are there. And then one day, I think there was an essay, something about health insurance and children's health insurance and something. There was an article about it, like a more academic article. And then there was sort of this narrative that a doctor had written about an encounter in a clinic about like what it looked like on the ground. And I was just immediately taken by that. And I was like, wow, this is pretty neat. This is someone taking something that's really complex and digesting it into a story that people can kind of, relate to. And I was sort of really hooked on that pretty quickly. Like this idea was really neat to think about that. And then just kind of fortuitously for me as a fourth year medical student, some other students started up like a narrative medicine interest group or something where some students were really interested in writing, and it's something that hadn't happened heretofore, prior to that, and they just started it. And I showed up for a meeting, and I actually, one of the students had a contact with someone in something called MS JAMA, which is, I don't think it's no longer in existence, but back in those days, JAMA had like a monthly portion where medical students could submit. So my writing was not good enough for the actual print edition, but they actually had an online edition at that time. And so again, that first time you get that in print was like, your name and the title was so awesome. Um, Interestingly enough, that online people say that everything you put on the web is there forever. Well, that's not true because these essays are gone because it was very sort of, but nonetheless, it was still that was the beginning. And so, and again, maybe we'll talk about more mechanistically, but that was sort of the beginning of writing. And then over time, it just became it sort of kind of built on itself. And as I began to read more about medicine and narratives about medicine, I found that there was this issues about like my own experience as an African American person, and race in medicine seemed like it wasn't there, and a lot of stories weren't touching on that in a way that sort of connected to my experience, and that's sort of how I began to sort of write about that topic more specifically. And I just remember that it was in 2012 when I got kind of almost published simultaneously in JAMA and Annals of Internal Medicine. Those two sections they have, one's called Peace of My Mind, one called On Being a Doctor, and they all kind of happened almost simultaneously in 2012, just the way the publishing cycle worked. And then you get response from people all over the world, the UK, Australia, and across America, and they really realize that you're sort of tapping into something, perhaps larger. And so that was really when it kind of came to the idea that I could actually, write a book. And so they just kind of built. So it's like you start really small and you just sort of built into something that kind of, took off from there.
Right. Well, that's an interesting story, and I think Perry, you come from a very different background, quite a literary background, would you say?
I come from a writing family. My mother was a writer, and she taught writing her entire career she taught English and creative writing at Manhattan Community College to an incredibly interesting and diverse student body. My mother was kind of messianic on the subject of writing. My mother believed you have a book in you that nobody else can write, and that you really ought to write that book. And when I was a child, if you wanted to get out of walking the dog and you said, I had the greatest idea for a short story, I got to go write it down before I forget it, she'd walk the dog for you so you could write your short story. She
Wow.
believed that. I mean, I would compare it to growing up in a musical family, which mine was not. That, you might grow up in a family where they believed that a child who grew up without playing a musical instrument would somehow be missing out on, some of the great joys that life had to offer. She felt that way about writing, but the corollary was she felt that a writer needs a day job. She felt that, this is something you do and you love it and it adds tremendously to your life, but don't expect to make a living. So I was biology major in college, but every course I took that was not a biology course was a writing workshop, and I wrote short stories. And as Esther said, I accumulated rejection slips, hundreds and hundreds and
Mhm.
hundreds of rejection slips. And as I was starting medical school, I was a biology major. I wanted to be a doctor. As I was starting medical school, an editor at a woman's magazine, Mademoiselle, bought a short story, and as you say, that was the greatest thing that had ever happened. Oh my goodness. And then, so I would say I went into this knowing that I would write the way you might know that you'd go on playing the piano for your pleasure. And I didn't see any connection to medicine. This was what I would do. I would write my stories and then I would be a doctor. And I wanted to do both. And then that same editor, when I was a first year medical student, contacted me and said, we're going to do a special issue on being a woman in the first year of medical school, law school, and business school. This is a long time ago. It was more noteworthy, more newsworthy. And she said, and I told them that I had just bought a short story from someone who is a woman in the first year of medical school. You want to write it? And I thought, oh, how hard can it be? Uh, Made a lot of mistakes, and wrote an article which they initially thought was much too lighthearted, because everyone knew medical school was brutal and dehumanizing, and everyone knew all kinds of things which were not necessarily my experience. But that was how I first started thinking that I was actually in a somewhat secret world that people might like to hear about. And then, of course, later on, I began to feel that even the fiction I wrote, that it was my world. And so I started writing about I wrote about medical school, I wrote about residency training, and I was very fortunate that it turned out it was a secret world, and people were interested in hearing these stories. And then the last thing I'll say about that is that I then also found out that I had a little bit of a passport. That is to say, that I could call people up in your world, Esther, or in your world, Damon, and I could say, tell me what keeps you up at night. I'm writing about this. And that because I had the medical background, people in the medical world would talk to me in ways that I could use. I sort of figured out a lot of things about reporting and about writing about my world, which I really enjoyed.
That's really an interesting way to talk about sort of the passport. And I think we often talk about traveling between worlds. In medicine, we have the land of the healthy and the land of the sick. And I think we also have kind of the land of writing, the land of our clinical practice. For me, I was a straight science person. I was MD, PhD, planning to be in a lab all my life, maybe go to a clinic once a week and be in neurology. I was a neurology bound person. I did a PhD in neuroscience. And, but somewhere along the line in my internship before neurology residency, I fell in love with my patient stories. I found them so fascinating.
I'll tell you an ethical dilemma that I faced, and it probably touches, it's both an ethical dilemma and a writing dilemma. That is to say, one of the things which interested me, surprised me, and kept pulling me in different directions when I started practicing primary care pediatrics was one of the reasons you do primary care pediatrics is you so value these relationships with families, with parents. You watch children grow up, you see them again and again. Expected all that, knew I'd love that. There were repeated incidences where I was in that relationship with parents I liked, respected, felt had a much harder job than any job I'd ever done myself as a parent. And yet I wasn't sure that their children were okay, were safe. And it was that ongoing relationship in which every time there was this question of, can I safely send this baby, this toddler, this child home with this family, or is it my obligation to call for help? And yet people I knew and liked, not like it had been during residency in the hospital where it was, somebody you were just meeting, but that tension between really liking people, really cheering for them to manage in their difficult and complicated lives, but also feeling that it was my job as the pediatrician to say, but I'm afraid it's just not safe. And the reason I'm going to bring up writing is because one of the things that has struck me repeatedly is it's much easier for me to write about some of the remarkable, heroic families who I've worked with, who if they read this and knew it was them, I can say that, I can tell you stories about having said to people, read this if you don't want anyone else to see it. No one else will ever see it. I just needed to write it. And in all of those cases, people said, use our real names, publish these. We want the world to see them. But these other families that I'm talking about, that wouldn't have been the case. And I'm bringing it up because I eventually wrote a novel about that dilemma, or in part about that dilemma of being in that relationship with people you were liked, who you were cheering on, but feeling that at some point it's going to be your job to call the Department of Social Services to say, I just don't think this child is safe.
Wow, that's fascinating. Esther, do you have an ethical dilemma that I'm sure you've faced many in the emergency department, but that you wrote about, and maybe how you used writing to grapple with it?
I think my answer is a little more meta about the writing itself, because I think often when you're in the emergency department, because we have this kind of canary in the coal mine role in healthcare, people are often reaching out to us early on in what ends up being, say an outbreak, an epidemic, an incidence of violence, and people are like a mass casualty, and people reach out to the ER and say, we'd love it if you could write something about this. And you're like, um, like anything you write is so singular, it's basically about a specific person or a group of persons. And so um, and especially the way that I am asked to write, because I write for popular media a lot. It's like, can you write about this? You have a deadline in 2 days, which I know journalists are very used to. But as a as a scientific writer, where we write on the order of like, you write something over the course of 6 to 9 months, it feels like you just don't have time to like figure out all the moving pieces and know whether you're writing about something that's really special and unique or something that's really affecting large swaths of people. And so I think just the right representation of these things and knowing when it is time to write or whether it's not time, that's not your story to tell, even though you were there at the time. For example, the very first case of COVID in Oregon happened. It was actually caught a block from me, and it was
Oh,
the custodian at my kid's school was the very first case. So I knew a ton about it almost right away. It's now been in the papers and everything, so that story is out and there's nothing else. It's just that I knew it because I'm part of this community and this is somebody who's dear to me and to my kids, And I think people just knew that I was in the general vicinity and asked if I could write about that. And I was like, because this is somebody I know, I actually could not. And I think things like that come up all the time where you're like, what are my motives for writing about this? you know, am I the right person to write? What privacy am I breaking, whether it's professional or personal? And just like having to just stop and be like, I love to write, I love to communicate, I love to tell these stories. And there's times when it's just not you, and you have to step away from that story, no matter how much interest it would have in the public eye. So just things like that. I think there's always a tension from doing a sort of public duty and then also feeling like people get to have privacy and it's too soon to draw any conclusions or to write the sort of thing that they want me to write.
I think it's really interesting. And if I can circle back to endocarditis, this is probably like the defining disease of my training. You know, as I was starting to say before, I it was an endocarditis patient that I met as an intern who I got to talk to every single day and found his story fascinating. But one of the biggest ethical dilemmas I had was not with him, but another endocarditis patient when I was, I think, a sub intern maybe, and I think it was at the VA. But it was a guy who had blown out his heart valve a number of times from using intravenous drugs and getting infected. And he really needed a new heart valve. He was HIV positive. And we were debating, should this guy get a valve? Because he's HIV positive. He's, relapsed many times. And I was like, this guy needs a valve. And we had an ethics committee meeting, the guys with the tweed coats and the leather elbow patches, those guys came to talk to us. And what was fascinating is I did write about it, but it wasn't until I really wrote about it that I really understood the surgeon's point of view. Like in this ethics committee meetings, I just kind of blew them off a little bit. But I remember him saying that, you may think it sounds all noble and good to do it, but I'm the one up to my elbows in HIV positive blood in a guy who might just go out and shoot up again. What happens if one of my residents gets infected or has a needle stick? What do I tell their children? And it wasn't until I wrote it out that I really could see the other perspective as this whole and complex and multifaceted perspective. To me, it was just a stock answer initially in real life, but it was much more nuanced when I wrote about it. And it really, really made me think, and it made me recognize the power of writing, because in real life, you can't rewind, you can't slow down, there's no do-over. And so many times in medicine, we wish we could have a do-over. Now, could we avoid the pulmonary embolus, rewind the EKG, all these things we can't. But when you write, you can. And not only can you rewind, you can change the angle of the camera. You can start the frame before it happened. You could even suppose to the future. You can combine different perspectives. And so countless times I find that I learn more about an issue once I write about it. And one of the ethical things, and maybe Damon, I'll tap this to you, is what do you think about the ethics of putting your own story in when you're telling stories of patients?
that's a great question. Daniel, he was just saying about writing, being able to like kind of have time and to be able to sort of get the story in a certain way. That really actually appealed to me about writing. Because in my earlier life, I thought you can't tell from the Zoom call, but I'm really tall, and basketball was sort of my sort of initial passion in many ways. And of course, you have that game you play poorly, you can't undo it, you can't redo it. And so the beauty of writing was that I could kind of take a story and kind of go back and this and that. And it was really sort of appealing sort of way to think about things. But to your question about several things actually that I'm thinking about there. Because when you mention about ethics, I'm in psychiatry, and so psychiatry. There's just so many ethical dilemmas in psychiatry, and even first and foremost, the idea that here in psychiatry we have the ability to there's this idea of forcing treatment, right? Of treating someone in an involuntary commitment. That's something that's very different than in many other areas of medicine. I mean, there are certainly exceptions, but in general, that's a very different sort of thing. And I just remember when I initially was exposed to psychiatry, I was in a hospital, and by the time I would see those situations, that process had already sort of played itself out, and I wasn't the one making that call. But then when I got into the emergency department as a psychiatry resident, it really sort of hit me, this idea, this ethical dilemma of like where patients were needing to be because a lot of the problems with sort of psychiatric care in terms of hospital stays and things of that, hospital bed availability and things of that sort, patients would have to be transported, and the only way they could be transported was by police and having to be involuntarily sort of committed, regardless of how they presented. And so found myself one day in this dilemma of like there was a person who chose to come voluntarily for care, and then here I am being the one wanting to get this person care, but then having to be the one who's sort of doing this thing that feels like it's not right, because you have this sort of all these dimensions of once you go down this path of having being IVC'd, as we say, what does that mean for that person down the road? But then you're trying to get them care, and that's the only way you can get them care. And so the writing process really helped me. So I wrote about this story because actually I've seen this sort of story many times, and I started to write about it. And I wanted it helped me learn more about the context, how we got here, but also in the process of researching how we sort of people have been trying to make this better and moving forward. So when I wrote that, of course, I'm injected into that story. And so one of the dilemmas, sort of finally getting to your question, one of the dilemmas of like thinking about putting yourself in the story is that when I initially started writing, particularly my first book, which is about race and medicine, I thought about it just writing about uh, just the stories, like the issue for itself, only like a kind of purely journalistic standpoint, and then secondarily just from a patient story standpoint, without me being involved in the story at all. And then as I started to get more and more into it, I realized that um, people wouldn't really, I guess I kind of felt like people wouldn't really appreciate the story the same way if they didn't understand my own background and how I sort of came to the issues and how I then interpreted certain situations the way that I did. And so that's where my own sort of story kind of came into it. But it's a balance because you don't want to be like, this is just all about me. It feels like the story is really about the person, the patient, the larger history, the larger context of what their experience means. And so there's really delicate balance. And sometimes I struggle with that, like, geez, who really cares about me in this situation? It's really about the story. So it's always this balance that I'm always sort of constantly, navigating.
I think people do care about you, and maybe I don't know, Perry, if you could talk to establishing the narrator as a reliable person,
Mm.
or unreliable if they're biased, and sort of human credentials. I mean, you've written a lot about your own experiences. Do you feel that's part of what makes you able to come up and tell this story?
It depends a little bit on the story, and I actually value also being able to keep myself out of certain stories. I mean, when I teach, and I teach a personal essay to journalism graduate students, one of the ways I start this is by saying that you don't just have one personal voice. You make a choice with a particular story. First of all, that you're adding something to the story. And, I'm teaching journalism. That is to say, I'm teaching people who are writing to be read. I'm not teaching people who are writing, to process the experience. There are many, many valid reasons why you might write about what happens to you. I'm teaching people who are writing to be read and read professionally. So I talk about it as a decision you make. Will this, using the personal voice here, help more people read this, help them read it and I think Damon was just addressing them, help them read it in a richer and more complex way? Is this a story where the personal voice belongs? But that then, having decided, yes, you have to choose your personal voice, and you have to say that you actually contain many, many, many personal voices, and that you can experiment. And the personal voice in which some of what we were just talking about, what Damon was talking, the personal voice in which you discuss, this is the thing I do that makes me most uncomfortable or that worries me, may be very different from the personal voice in which you're, complaining about something which you think is really damaging your patients or damaging your colleagues. It's a series of decisions, and you make it thinking in part about the eyes and ears of the people who will read this. And we've also, I think Esther's mentioned this, it matters whether you're writing for the general public or whether you're writing, as Damon was maybe initially, for stories that will come out in a medical journal to your colleagues. Those all affect your voice and your choice, and they're interesting and they're complicated. I love being able to use my personal voice, but I also, honestly, I started out writing when I was a medical student, writing about medicine, not writing, but writing about medicine as a medical student. And oh my gosh, the idea of anyone listening to me when I was a medical student. I mean, it was intoxicating. As a third year medical student, you spend your life being the least knowledgeable, least experienced person in a room full of people who can help. And you're the medical student, and to actually come home and write about it. But I would say there was also a little bit of a tendency to sort of make it sound like, hey, I was the only really sensitive person in the room. I was the only person who picked up these nuances. And having read such essays by a lot of other people, I think it's something we all feel, who's listening to me. But later on, you kind of, you really do realize that, A, as Damon said, it actually is all about the patient. The patient is at the center of the story. And B, if the moral is I'm the only sensitive person there, something's gone wrong.
Yeah, so I really resonate with that because I liked it when because there's some books you read by physician writers. I don't want to, no one here, just so I'll say, but somewhere, I'll preface by saying that where they sort of come across like they've never made a mistake and they're like the greatest person in the world and they're always doing all the heroic stuff. You see, I don't have much use for that, and so I felt like it was really important for me to sort of to show readers my own limitations, because if I'm trying to make a point about how we need to do this better, or that better, I feel like it's helpful for them to sort of be able to say, okay, look, he is acknowledging his own sort of shortcomings in this particular way, and then maybe I can connect with him and think about what I could do better if he's sort of coming through in that sort of lens. So it's really important for me to do my writing and ground it in that way versus sort of being on some sort of mountaintop and preaching down to people. I don't find that as so. That's really important. When I think about how I include myself in the writing, that's what I like to do.
I'm curious if any of you gotten, and maybe Esther, you could take this first, gotten any feedback from readers that have an issue with what voice you take, either positive or negative.
Oh, yeah. It's
Especially you, right?
well, I do want to acknowledge this whole bit about like writing from your own voice and putting personal bits into it, as both of you do so well. And by the way, I just want to acknowledge, because for me, I'm very sensitive to this, as Danielle knows, I have not written a book. In fact, one of my questions for my other panelists, how you ever even like wake up one morning and feel that you can write a whole book. Because as someone who only writes essay length things, the idea of writing continuously beyond 800 to 1200 words, which is what my editors give me, is like mind blowing. I cannot even fathom it. So I'm just going to put that on a shelf for a question. But it is giving something of yourself. It's a vulnerability when you kind of share what you feel. And my first positive writing experience, this is my earliest one, is I had taken a creative writing course, and my professor had encouraged me to submit it to an award. I submitted it. Thought there's no way I'll win anything. And it turns out they don't say anything to you. They announce it on the stage at graduation. So my parents come out for my graduation at Yale, where I was a very mediocre student, but I won this writing award on the stage at graduation, which was like wonderful. And the piece that I had written was about my family, because I have a wild family history, and there's like suicide and affairs and illicit it's like it's like every secret my family has hidden for generations was in this essay, this really like long form essay. And I was very proud of it. And my parents were like, we are proud of you. And you will never share this essay with anybody. Like, kind of like, how dare you? You know, this is like very private stuff that half the family did not know about. And I took that lesson really hard. And I have found it very hard as a generally private person to be like, insert myself. But I will say, often editors are like, we like you writing about these things for a reason, because people want to know your point of view and get a little insight into your world. So I feel often pushed to reveal more of myself. But it is also true that if you want to reach a doctor at my institution, there's a number that you can call and demand to speak to me. And many people avail themselves of that option. And so I am really close with the switchboard operators at my hospital. They basically will call me and say, what did you write now? And just so you know, we blocked these calls for you, but here are the people who called in case you're interested. And I, take over a gift basket at Christmas, at the winter holidays, just because a lot of their work is screening for me. So definitely, as you put yourself into these things, there are always going to be people who don't agree with you. And I think people are very outspoken about that. And we are, all three of us, I'm sure, are very findable people.
Yeah.
All three of us.
Yeah.
Esther, sounds like you have a novel in you there with that story you described.
Yeah. Here's your book.
There you go.
Exactly. There's your book.
There you go.
I haven't actually asked for formal written consent, although I think there are publications that want you to, but I have on multiple occasions said, usually when part of the story is something so clear, such an unusual condition, that it's obvious to me that everybody who was on the ward at that time will know what there's just, when I wrote the story about the child in my primary care clinic who had alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency and needed the liver transplant, we only had one child at the health center who got a liver transplant. When I wrote the story about the family who were suspected of child abuse admitted to the hospital, and it turned out it was osteogenesis imperfecta. I mean, it's not a diagnosis that we make commonly. But also, or I'll tell you one quick story. I was working with a group of medical students at Bellevue, the hospital, the same hospital that Danielle was talking about, and we had we asked to talk to a grandmother whose granddaughter had been in the intensive care unit for a long time with terrible injuries. And she talked to the students for a long time, and it was fascinating, and I think it moved them a great deal. But the story I wanted to write about afterwards was that after she finished talking, she was crying, everyone was crying, she hugged me, and I hugged her back. And one of the medical students, male, asked me afterward, is it okay to hug a patient? And I thought that would be an interesting story to write about. And I went and I asked her permission. I wasn't going to identify her, but again, the story would be clear to anyone who, knew the ward. And I wrote the story, and then a long time afterwards, somebody asked me if I'd asked the medical students permission, and it had never occurred to me.
The answer is yes. In some instances, that people have had consent, sort of very similar to how Perri described it. Although most of the cases that I write about, I try and write about ones that are where there's not such a overwhelmingly unique. Unfortunately, a lot of things that are happening to these people I'm describing, or some of them are pretty bad. They're often not singular, which is its own sort of sad commentary, unfortunately. And so sometimes it's not as if any patient will come back and say, well, you wrote about this person, or even a colleague will say, well, it's not always so clearly identifiable, unfortunately, in some ways. But yeah, I'm curious to know from Danielle, like because I found in my experience that it depends on the venue in which you're writing. The standards themselves often sort of are a little different. So I'm curious and readers and listeners might want to know about that, because I've always been curious about that myself.
Yeah. And so certainly if I'm writing in real time, I do ask patients' consent to do that. If I'm writing about something that happened, 10 years ago, or in the distant past, or the patient's long deceased, or I can't track them down, then I don't. But, even in medicine, like psychiatry, many things are very common. So one can use a broad outline So when you write for a place like the New York Times, you can't combine patients,
Right,
and
exactly.
you can't change names,
Exactly.
but you can use minimal detail. I mean, that's one way to just leave things out.
Yes.
So that's one way I will do that for publication like that. Um, in a book, or if I'm writing about a general topic that's not specific, then I might combine some instances where I'm not really referencing an individual patient. But for a detailed profile, I do try to ask. And certainly for many patients, I find, like my patient this morning, they're trying so hard to get their damn story told. They're thrilled, usually,
Yes.
that you're going to tell their story. Um, the
Yes.
piece that I just wrote last week was a letter that a patient wrote to one of my colleagues, worried about immigration.
Mhm.
And the letter was so poignant that the patient asked to her doctor, could you write me a letter that if ICE handcuffs me, can they please handcuff me in the front and not the back because of my rotator cuff tendonitis? Um, it was so poignant. And so the doctor reached out to the patient and asked if I could talk to her. And she said yes. And then when I spoke to them, they said, please tell the story. I really, I have no way of getting the story told. And then I felt this incredible both weight and honor to be able to tell this story, but sort of this duty of how do I tell it in a way that's A, not incriminating, but B, to make her story become part of the discourse, that that she deserves to be heard and isn't
Mhm.
able to be heard above and beyond a my chart message.
Mhm.
So but yes, I think when at all possible, we try to get consent. When I can't get consent, then I ask myself the question, is this a respectful rendering of the patient? And I recognize that's subjective, but like, is there something in there that's important and pressing, or is it just a good war story? And if it's just a good war story, that's not enough.
Right.
And then if I think the patient would be hurt by this, again, subjective, but then it goes under the bed. And there's plenty of stories.
Yep.
What I tell people is you can write about anything, but whether you publish it, that's a different story. You don't necessarily have to publish it to have the,
Mhm.
what made it important.
Or you can write a novel.
Yes.
Because
Or you
if
can
you
make
write
it
a novel, you can take that core emotion, that core moment, and then
Right.
you can set it in the 19th century. You can change everybody's gender, age, ethnicity, all the stuff you can't do in journalism. I mean, that's what I was sort of trying to say. There's some stuff which, as journalism or as memoir, is always going to have to stay under the bed unless you decide that you're going to write fiction.
All right.
I think she's talking to you, Esther. Yeah,
Right.
Now I'm going from essay to full-length book to fiction.
it's a novel.
Not gonna happen.
Right.
Not gonna happen.
I did want to say I agree with you so much about every story is not told. There's some stories that is this my story to tell, and there were certain stories in my first book, and people are like shocked by some of the details that I included in my the black man in the white coat. But there's stuff in there that I didn't include that was probably even more potentially provocative. But I thought someone might get harmed by this, and is this my story to tell their story? And so yeah, there's definitely cases where I have not done that. And I also will say for Danielle that there are many people, though, despite things that have happened to them, and you may think no one's going to want to know that, or that they would not want that to be known. Some people are really dying to have that story told. I'm a part of this project where there was a case at Duke where someone had been denied care during the era of segregation and had a really terrible outcome. And I mean, it's a current project that I'm working on. And so we've traced down the descendants, the people who are still living. And the question was whether or not do we tell the story and how do we tell it? And, first we were thinking maybe this is not our place to tell the story. They're like, oh, yes, no, please tell this story. We want this. We want people to know this story. So that's a really great example of how you have to approach people in that sort of way. And sometimes it's about building trust. And what does that person believe your intentions are good intentions in some ways. So I've experienced that as well.
I would agree that every time I've been given, and I think I'm probably selecting the situations in which I'm doing, but that when I say, and of course I won't use your real name, the number of times someone has said, I'd like you to use my real name, has really surprised me.
Exactly.
I still don't if I think it's gonna,
There's still those who say that if you are someone's physician, can you really get truly informed consent? Is there a power dynamic that makes it really difficult for a patient to say no if they
Yeah.
that way. But that's another conversation. I want to make sure we can move on a little bit to the logistics of writing. There are lots of questions about that.
Not as much now. I got two teenage sons, and they're like doing so many things, and they're just learning how to drive. So it's a little bit of a challenge. For me, I would say when I would really get into writing, I have this sort of goal. It's like 300 words a day. It doesn't matter how bad those words, doesn't matter how garbage it is, or if I can just do this and average it out. So I may one day, maybe a couple days might be zero, but if I can get a 600 day or a 700 word day, and it adds up, and I actually would track it. And that actually helped get me on the ball. Now, as to when you would put those words onto paper, sometimes I would go in stretches where I would say I would get up early for a couple weeks in a row, and just get up early, an hour earlier than I normally would, and just put whatever I could into paper. And then I get really tired and say, no, I don't want to do that anymore. And then and then at some point I'll stay up, an hour or so later. And I kind of just going to go back and forth between those two extremes. But it's I'm not, as you can tell, I'm not super organized. And so it's kind of like I have to get this inspiration and just kind of flow out. But the 300 word a day thing really did kind of help me concretely, push forward when it came down to actually writing the book.
Well, bravo. Any of you guys do that daily writing routine?
No, but I want to be Damon when I grow up.
Okay.
I've spent my whole life, thinking, I should write every day, and I write in spurts, and I write, as Esther said, I write on deadlines. Deadlines help me a lot. I write a lot sometimes and not at all other times. And I feel guilty about it all.
Mine isn't anything anybody should replicate, but I'm a nocturnalist. So I only do overnight shifts in the emergency department. So I'm basically like very awake at nights, even when I'm not working. So I think of it as a shift, because at some point you have to be like, am I serious about writing? Am I not? And so I basically just schedule it like, if someone wants me to write something, I look at my schedule. And if I have, fewer ER shifts that week, I'll be like, I can do it. And then I schedule it like a shift. And I usually stay up most of a night to write, because I have 4 kids, ages 9 through 17. They're still in my house. They are a lot all the time. And so that's the quiet time that I have. And so, and how do you stay up with that? It's like, you have to feel so passionately about it. I can only write things that I feel very strongly need to be put out there, because I'm too tired. If I don't care about it or it's boring, then you can't stay up all night. There's no amount of caffeine that will keep you awake for something that you don't care about.
So I want to ask a question about, working with editors. Have you ever gotten a piece returned to you with edits that changed your voice in a way you didn't identify with? And how do you handle that? Perri, jump in. I see you nodding.
It's happened various times. I think, once or twice, to the extent where I've said, I don't want to publish this, if not just so much changing the voice, but taking out something which I felt absolutely had to be said, or it's pretty rare that it goes that far. My experience has generally been that if there are 1 or 2 or 3 things which are absolutely life or death for me, I can get those if I'm willing to let some other things go. But it does happen, and it happened especially, I think, at the beginning. As I say, I wrote my first piece about being a woman in medical school, and the editors wanted it to be about the brutal, dehumanizing experience of being a medical student. And what she said to me is, everybody knows medical students aren't friends. Everybody knows they're all ruining each other's experiments to bring down the curve, so that they can get higher grades. And I said, did you know it's pass fail? And she couldn't have been less interested. It was interesting. It was, how I kind of learned that people brought to this some very strict expectations, and we compromised. I didn't say anything that wasn't true, but we cut out all the humor, because everyone knew medical school wasn't funny. Willing
to accept not get too discouraged. I have actually a shoebox. I'm a big tall guy, big shoes. A shoebox full of all the rejections.
Right.
Back in the day when you got paper rejections, and I would even get the ones in email and I'd print them out and just put them in that box, and that would kind of be this reminder of in some ways the journey. Yeah, I would say just don't get, because we all have those feelings of doubt. And I feel like that's just the best advice I can give. Just keep pushing.
Yeah, I say it's a numbers game, kind of like dating. You just have to do a lot. And I once had a piece that was published in a journal and went into Best American Essays. And I got an email from a writing professor. It was a Midwest college saying how much they liked the essay and that he actually uses it in his writing class. As an example of how to do an essay, which is really quite an honor to get. But I look at his name signature, and he's an editor of a literary journal and magazine. His college rings a bell. I go back and look at my rejection pile, and the same essay was rejected from that very journal. He wasn't editor at the time, but I remember because the essay came back as a paper with post-it notes on it saying, "It is so dull, really boring." And
Wow.
I also tell the people who submit to BLR that, a lot of it is subjective. A lot of his numbers, we get 5,000 submissions. We can print, 35 in an issue. So, lots of great stuff and lots of mediocre stuff will get rejected, but to not take it personally.
Wait, and you have issues quarterly? How often is?
So we are twice a year, actually, is Bellevue Literary Review. It's an actual journal with that great book smell, also digital issue. So we publish 2 issues a year. And we publish fiction, poetry, and nonfiction, but creative nonfiction, not academic. If it's got footnotes, it's not going into BLR.
The other 2 basic pieces of advice, what is, read the magazine or the journal that you're submitting to. Read it. Know what they publish.
Yes.
And if you are lucky enough to get a rejection from somebody who signs it, even if it's not very detailed, write back, thank that person, and send them something else. Because if somebody knows you, if somebody likes you enough, that's a relationship. That person will, I guarantee that person will eventually take something.
Yeah, if you pester them enough. Although as an editor, I would say, give a little space.
Yeah.
Don't race back, 50 more things. But read the submission guidelines. I'll tell you at BLR, we say that our word max is 5,000 words. People submit an 8,000 word piece. We can't fit it. And you've wasted your time, our time. We don't publish a romance. Well, we get romance or sci-fi. So it does pay to take a look and see what the people publish. If the word max is 1,200, or 800 for a newspaper, don't submit 1,500 words. You're just wasting your time.
Another advice I get, people always ask me all the time about writing books, and they'll send me stuff. I think I always tell people to start small, start local, and just build up. It's like you want to just come in, you want to just sort of do this great American novel. I mean, I guess some people can do that, but it's my experience has been that it just sort of builds on itself. You get better over time, and just starting small. I started again with an online thing that doesn't exist anymore, right? And then I went from there to like a local newspaper, and you just sort of gradually build up and get better. I think it's like putting together like a 1,000-word, 1,000-piece puzzle, right? Just one piece at a time. That's sort of how I think of it.
Yeah, and literary magazines are great places to submit your work. I'd recommend that you subscribe to 1 or 2 to support them, because they have to exist in order to be there for you to publish your work. You could become a BLR subscriber, but there are many great ones. But pick 1 or 2, and for $20 or $30 a year, subscribe to them and see what they actually publish.
But it's also true that if you find one which has a lot of stuff in it that you love, then you and the editor have some common sensibility, right? If you're reading it and thinking, oh, how can they publish this stuff? They should be publishing me. It's the wrong journal.
Exactly.
Good point.
Sometimes too, I think a lot of publishing, at least in the kind of things that I write, is timing, and so there may be something that is so interesting, beautifully written, and it's just not the right time. And the example I'll give is a long time ago, I pitched to an editor. I was like, I think people don't understand how the NIH funding process works. It's interesting to me because it's like not what you would think. Universities don't pay for, research to happen. People are their own fundraisers. And they were like, that is interesting to no one. And I kind of shelved it. This week was the moment.
Exactly.
Right.
Was the moment. came to me wanting to know, how does the funding process, like, why is it a disaster that and this is something a mentor told me a long time ago. She's like, write everything. If you have something in your head, write it, just write it. And then it will sit there and there will be a hook. There will be a time, whether it's for your style, for your, for your voice, your topic, whatever. These things just ebb and flow, and maybe that rejections are just a matter of timing, and there will be a moment for it. So I think obey that urge right into the void, and then let it come to the surface when the timing seems right, and just keep trying.
That's a great point. I also recommend to people to take writing workshops. There's a lot of craft to be learned. And, I always say no one wakes up writing like James Joyce except James Joyce. Everyone else has got to learn it. And so I benefited so greatly from the writing workshops that I took and working one-on-one writing teachers, writing groups. And it takes many years to learn the craft. I would say don't randomly send someone, a 100-page manuscript and say, oh, hey, could you take a look at that? That's a very big ask. Of most people don't have the time for that. But you can actually pay people, a good editor, freelance editors. You can pay them and they will take a deep dive into your work. And that can be very worthwhile to do because it does take a lot to do. And I think about my writing in the beginning, and I really do say that my writing teachers and editors have taught me a ton. So don't underestimate that.
Yeah, I had a freelance editor for book one, and I would never have gotten off the ground without her.
Esther, you also, in addition to your writing, write for social media a lot, I think more than any of us. And that's kind of its own sort of writing. Can you talk about what that's like?
I mean, rest in peace, Twitter, but I did and continue to. I actually moved over to Blue Sky, which is a great community for me right now. But I think it's a different kind of, it is writing. I was convinced that by an editor, actually, who got me to write an essay. But I was like, oh, I don't really write long form things. I think I basically write in tweets. And she's like, if you just take a whole thread and put it into a paragraph, like that's virtually a piece of writing. But it is, these social media platforms are really made for very short declarative things, getting across simple points, quick points. Obviously, it's like the dead opposite of what I do in my scientific writing, which has so much nuance. It's like all nuance, And so I think there's something like quick, satisfying, you reach a broad audience, but I think it just is very easy to miss finer points and to have a detailed discussion about pretty much anything. But I actually think it's part of this whole process of like publishing, because you find an audience, I think, for your main point in social media. I find it a direct connection to journalists. Often journalists are sitting out there saying, I wish I could talk to doctors and scientists. And the doctors and scientists are like, I wish I could tell this story in the popular media. This is always true. Each group feels that the other group does not respect or care or want to talk to them. And so I think social media is this way that we've been able to bridge that gap a little bit. And I feel like my best function of social media is often just connecting people from each of those disciplines so that we can communicate to the general public and to our elected officials and things like that.
And you don't find the pile-on too exhausting?
It's exhausting. Yeah, it's exhausting. I have much better boundaries. And I also know when to shut it off. And that's an example I need to set for my kids as well. But I find it a really helpful tool at times.
And Perri, so you are also a journalist. So how do you see journalism as different than writing the creative nonfiction that many people in healthcare like to do?
I think that it's been fascinating to be in a journalism department. It's been fascinating to work with aspiring journalists and to kind of learn their professionalism, to learn, some of the rules we've been talking about, the not changing anything, the not making anything up, the absolute importance of reporting and of sourcing and of double checking sources. I've come to have a tremendous respect for it as a way of telling stories, and also the thinking about your market and your audience. It's really about getting the story told to the people who are going to read it and hear it in the most effective way possible. And I think I've learned a lot.
Yeah, and I think the experience of working with fact checkers, that is an eye-opening experience. And they're, the fact checkers of the New York Times, the New Yorker, are like
Oh,
no
yeah.
other. Oh my
They're
goodness.
amazing.
That is very true.
I did a piece for the New York Times on why doctors don't take sick days. And I was relating when I was med consult as a senior medical resident, I got pretty sick while in the ED. And did I go home? Of course not. I grabbed a thing of Maalox off the nurse's cart, like, lemon mint. I chugged it, went up to the call room and promptly puked my guts out. And then my intern put an IV into my antecubital vein, and I continued being med consult for the rest of the night with an IV in. And, of course I wouldn't go home. But the fact checker said, oh, they didn't make lemon mint flavor Maalox in the years that you were a resident. So that's the degree to which they'll go back and check. I'm like, oh, so I just changed it to antacid because I didn't remember. I was pretty sure it was lemon mint, but I puked it all up anyway. But that kind of detail makes you realize what it means to publish in a journalistic venue where it's a newspaper of record that is going to stay there. And if there's a mistake, very different in your book, that's you're writing, but in a journalistic venue, it's quite different. And so it makes you write differently in that you think carefully about each thing you write. Is that factually provable? If not, out it goes. I'll share one first. One writing teacher said he put a Post-it note on his desk that says, stay seated. Because you always want to get up and keep your rear end in the chair. Just stay seated for the duration of the half hour, the hour. Do not get up and just actually keep at it. I find that very helpful.
So I'll tell you what I tell the journalism students and what I really do believe, which is that once you've got a draft on paper, we've got something to work with. This is a situation where, if the person who sits there saying, no, that first paragraph is not the first paragraph I dreamed of. I used to have a great quote from Virginia Woolf hanging over my desk, which basically said sometimes that brilliant book is my enemy, the one that I sort of heard in my head and I've started writing it. And what's coming out on paper is not what I imagined, but you have to kind of reach across that. I sort of say to my students, get us a draft. Yep. We'll workshop it, we'll edit it, we'll improve it. Maybe you'll throw out 3/4 of what you wrote, but it's such a different process making something that you've written better once it's there.
I totally agree. I find 100%. The hardest part, getting the first draft on the page. Yes. Revising, I love I can revise till the cows come home, but getting it on the page, that's the struggle. And if you can push yourself to throw something on the page.
I had a mentor who once, I would complain about not having enough time to write. And he was in my department. He's like, it's so funny you say that because I see your hand go up every time they need a volunteer for something that is completely what 100 other people could do. And he's like, every time you say yes, it's taking time away from your family and your writing. And he's like, I am watching you and judging you. So he did a couple things there, made me really conscious of all the time consuming yeses I was saying as I was taking me away from what I felt to be something I can uniquely do, which is write. And also he served as an accountability partner, which I see all of you plotting these writing groups and connections. And I really encourage them, if for no other reason, then you can find peers who can be accountability partners who can say, oh, last month we were talking and your goal was, 300 words per day or whatever thing. And have you done that? Somehow, if somebody is there actually expecting you to have certain writing outcomes, I think that does a ton more than the best of intentions of your own.
Yeah, I'll say a writing group and how my first sort of outside of workshop writing group started was another Bellevue happenstance. So medicine clinic used to be on the second floor on the west side. And on Wednesday afternoons was cardiology clinic on the south side. But there's always one extra fellow who had to go around the corner. And I was the second to last room. And Sandeep Jahar ended up in that corner, thrown around the corner. We ended up having next door rooms. And he was just starting his first book. And so we kind of started a writing group together with another writing colleague. And we did that probably for 3 or 4 or 5 years. Once a month we'd meet and you had to bring something to the table. And it was a fabulous way to work together. And again, I'll emphasize, writing workshops. So this year's BLR writing workshop is full, and thanks to a very generous grant from the Macy Foundation, but we plan to have future writing workshops open to the whole public. And there's so many writing workshops out there. And I know that many people in healthcare don't have time to do a weekly group, but there are online groups, there are flexible groups, there are one-on-one groups, find some folks from here, but it's really great to have, some people to keep you going. One bit of writing advice that I find as an editor, so editing other people's work really makes you a better writer. And one thing we find a lot of BLR, particularly in nonfiction, but also in fiction, is that there's a lot of throat clearing that people put on the page. They kind of write about what they're going to write about, and then the story starts. So a very common edit that we have is we hack away the first paragraph, the first page, the first 3 pages, the first 500 words. Start, where the story begins. And we like to think about, that the writer is holding a deck of cards and the reader can't see what the cards are. Now, of course, we want to dole those out in a pace that allows the reader to excitedly get the information. You can't keep the cards to your chest too long, and the reader gives up. But you want to make sure you have a bit of mystery, but then make sure you're generous with your readers, that they get the information. But don't waste time restating and restating. They say that about PowerPoint presentations, but writing is not PowerPoint. Don't list your objectives on the first slide. Just start with the story. Well, folks, thank you so much. This has been fabulous. And we encourage you to stay in touch. Again, a huge thank you to Perri Klass and Esther Choo and Damon Tweedy for joining us. A big thank you to the BLR Writing Workshop and the BLR staff.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, co-panelists.